The oncologist's words hung in the air like shattered glass, each syllable cutting deeper than the last, and Chloe Sanders watched the man across from her absorb the death sentence with nothing more than a slight tightening of his jaw. 6 months, maybe 8 if we're fortunate, doctor. Morrison continued, his tone professional but sympathetic. The pancreatic cancer has metastasized to your liver. We can try chemotherapy to extend your time, but I want to be honest about the prognosis. Chloe had accompanied dozens of patients to appointments like this during her 3 years as a patient advocate at Metropolitan Hospital. But something about this particular moment felt different. Alexander James sat perfectly still in the chair beside her, his 6'2" frame somehow seeming smaller under the weight of the diagnosis. He was 34 years old, the same age as her older brother would have been. Too young for this kind of news. "I understand," Alexander said quietly, his voice steady despite the tremor Chloe noticed in his hands. "What do we do now?" The appointment continued for another 20 minutes, covering treatment options, timelines, and logistics. Chloe took notes automatically, years of experience guiding her pen across the paper, even as her mind tried to process the reality of what she'd just heard. She'd read Alexander's file before meeting him that morning, knew he was unmarried, no children, parents deceased. The emergency contact section had been blank. When they finally left the office, Alexander walked beside her through the hospital corridors without speaking. The fluorescent lights cast harsh shadows across his face, highlighting the exhaustion that seemed to have settled into his features overnight. He was handsome in an understated way, with dark hair that fell slightly across his forehead and eyes the color of storm clouds. "Is there someone I can call for you?" Chloe asked gently as they reached the lobby. "Family, friends?" Alexander shook his head. "No, there's no one." Something in those 3 words made Chloe's heart constrict. She'd worked with isolated patients before, but the absolute emptiness in Alexander's statement felt particularly devastating given what he was facing. "Well," she said, adjusting the strap of her bag on her shoulder, "you have me. That's what patient advocates are for. I'll be with you through all of this, every appointment, every treatment. You won't go through it alone." Alexander looked at her then, really looked at her, and Chloe saw something flicker in his eyes before he quickly glanced away. "Thank you. That's kind of you to say." "It's not kindness," Chloe replied firmly. "It's my job, and I take it seriously." They scheduled his first chemotherapy session for the following week before Alexander left the hospital. Chloe watched him walk through the automatic doors into the bright afternoon sunlight, his shoulders squared despite everything. She didn't know yet that he'd driven himself there in a car worth more than most people's houses, or that he'd taken a private elevator up from an underground parking garage to avoid being recognized. She just saw a man facing death alone, and it bothered her more than it probably should have. That evening, Chloe sat in her modest apartment in Brooklyn, eating reheated pasta and scrolling through Alexander's medical file on her laptop. Something nagged at her about his case, about the man himself. She pulled up a search engine and typed his name on a whim, not expecting much. The results that flooded her screen made her nearly drop her fork. Alexander James, billionaire founder and CEO of James Industries, one of the largest manufacturing conglomerates in North America. Net worth estimated at $3.7 billion. Known for being intensely private, rarely photographed, and absolutely ruthless in business. The most recent article was from 2 months ago, speculation about why he'd stepped back from public appearances. Now she knew why. Chloe closed her laptop slowly, processing this information. In all her years as a patient advocate, she'd worked with people from every economic background, but never someone of this magnitude. And he'd sat in that appointment like any other patient, scared and alone, facing mortality with nothing but courage and silence. She thought about that blank emergency contact form and understood it differently now. Alexander James had built an empire but had no one to call when the world fell apart. The first chemotherapy session was brutal. Chloe arrived at the hospital early, making sure everything was prepared, and found Alexander already waiting in the treatment room. He wore jeans and a simple black sweater, looking nothing like the billionaire CEO from the photos she'd seen online. "Morning," he said, offering her a small smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. "How are you feeling?" "Terrified," he admitted, and the honesty in his voice surprised her. "I've negotiated billion-dollar deals, faced hostile takeovers, testified before Congress. But this scares me more than all of that combined." Chloe pulled a chair close to his treatment recliner and sat down. "That's completely normal. This is scary. Anyone who says otherwise is lying." The nurse came in to start the Roman 4, and Chloe watched Alexander's face carefully for signs of distress. He bore the needle stick without flinching, but she saw his knuckles whiten as he gripped the armrests. "Tell me something," Chloe said suddenly. "Something about yourself that has nothing to do with being sick." Alexander looked at her curiously. "Like what?" "Anything. A hobby, a memory, something you've always wanted to do. Just talk to me." He was quiet for a moment, considering. "I collect vinyl records," he finally said. "Jazz, mostly. My father started the collection when he was young, and I inherited it when he died. I've been adding to it ever since." "What's your favorite?" "John Coltrane, A Love Supreme. I must have listened to it 1,000 times, and it's different every time." They talked about music for the next hour as the chemicals dripped into his veins. Alexander told her about growing up in Philadelphia, how his father had worked factory floors before saving enough to start his own small manufacturing plant. How Alexander had built on that foundation, expanding and acquiring until James Industries became what it was today. "People think I was born into wealth," he said quietly. "They don't know my father wore the same 3 suits for 15 years, or that my mother worked 2 jobs to keep us afloat during the lean times. Everything I have, I built from what they sacrificed." Chloe found herself genuinely engaged, forgetting for stretches that this was a patient she was supposed to maintain professional boundaries with. Alexander was intelligent and thoughtful, with a dry sense of humor that emerged unexpectedly. When he smiled, really smiled, it transformed his entire face. By the time the session ended, Alexander looked exhausted but somehow lighter than when he'd arrived. As the nurse removed his Roman 4, he turned to Chloe. "Thank you for staying. You didn't have to sit here the entire time." "Yes, I did," Chloe said simply. "Same time next week. I'll be here." Over the following weeks, a routine developed. Chloe would meet Alexander at the hospital for his treatments and they would talk. She learned about his business philosophy, his love of old movies, his terrible cooking skills. He learned about her journey to becoming a patient advocate after watching her grandmother battle lung cancer, her passion for photography, her collection of vintage cameras she found at thrift stores. "Show me," Alexander said one day during his 3rd treatment session. Chloe pulled up photos on her phone, images she'd captured around New York City. Street scenes, architectural details, moments of unexpected beauty in urban chaos. Alexander studied each one carefully. "These are remarkable," he said, zooming in on a shot of sunlight breaking through clouds over the Brooklyn Bridge. "You have a real eye for this. It's just a hobby." The best things usually are. The things we do purely because they bring us joy, not because we're obligated. Chloe thought about that comment later, turning it over in her mind. When had she last done something purely for joy? Her work was meaningful but draining, and she'd let other aspects of her life fall by the wayside. The cancer was relentless. By the 6th week of treatment, Alexander had lost weight, his clothes hanging looser on his frame. The chemo made him nauseous and exhausted, but he never missed an appointment. He showed up, endured the treatment, and somehow always found the energy to ask Chloe about her week, her life, her dreams. "Why do you do this?" he asked one afternoon. "This job, I mean, it must be heartbreaking." Chloe considered the question carefully. "Because everyone deserves to have someone in their corner. Because facing something like this alone is unbearable, and if I can make even a small difference, then it's worth it." "You make more than a small difference," Alexander said quietly. "At least to me." Something in his tone made Chloe's heart skip, but she pushed the feeling aside. This was professional. He was her patient. That was all, but boundaries were getting harder to maintain. She found herself thinking about Alexander during her days off, wondering how he was feeling, if he was eating enough, if he was scared. She started bringing him homemade soup to treatments, claiming she'd made too much when really she'd prepared it specifically for him. He pretended to believe her, the corners of his eyes crinkling with suppressed amusement. 2 months into treatment, Alexander's oncologist ordered new scans. The results were not encouraging. The tumors had continued growing despite the aggressive chemotherapy. "We can try a different protocol," Dr. Morrison suggested, but his tone lacked conviction. Alexander sat very still, absorbing this news. Chloe wanted to reach for his hand but kept her own clasped tightly in her lap. "How long?" Alexander asked. "It's hard to say." "Maybe 4 months, possibly less." After the appointment, Alexander asked Chloe if she wanted to get coffee. It was the first time he'd suggested doing something outside the hospital setting, and she knew she should decline. But she didn't. They walked to a small cafe 2 blocks away, settling at a corner table with steaming cups. Alexander stared into his coffee for a long moment before speaking. "I've spent my entire adult life building something," he said. "Creating jobs, growing the business, making strategic decisions that affected thousands of people. I told myself the sacrifice was worth it, that I'd have time later for everything else. For relationships, for living." He laughed bitterly. "Turns out there is no later." "You're not dead yet," Chloe said firmly. "You're still here, Alexander. Right now, in this moment, you're alive." He looked up at her, something raw and vulnerable in his expression. "What should I do with the time I have left? What do you want to do?" "I don't know. I've forgotten how to want things that aren't related to business." Chloe leaned forward. "Then let's figure it out. Make a list. Everything you've ever thought about doing but never had time for." They spent the next hour compiling an improbable bucket list on napkins. Seeing the sunrise from the top of the Empire State Building, taking a cooking class, going to a jazz club, visiting the Met. Simple things, ordinary things, but Alexander approached each suggestion with growing enthusiasm. "Will you help me?" he asked as they prepared to leave. "With the list." Chloe knew she was crossing a line, knew this was beyond the scope of her job. But looking at Alexander's hopeful expression, she couldn't bring herself to refuse. "Yes," she said, "I'll help you." The next morning at 5 o'clock, Chloe met Alexander at the Empire State Building. He'd arranged private access to the observation deck, and they rode the elevator up through the sleeping city. The eastern sky was just beginning to lighten, deep purple fading to pink. They stood at the railing, shoulders almost touching, and watched the sun rise over New York City. Light spilled across the buildings, transforming the urban landscape into something magical. Alexander was quiet beside her, but Chloe could feel the emotion radiating from him. "Thank you," he said softly as the sun cleared the horizon. For what? For reminding me what it feels like to be alive. Chloe turned to look at him and found him already watching her. In the golden morning light, she saw past the illness, past the fear, to the man he was underneath. Strong, intelligent, achingly lonely. And in that moment, she realized with startling clarity that she was falling for him. The realization should have terrified her. This was her patient, a dying man, the worst possible person to develop feelings for. But her heart didn't care about logic or propriety or self-preservation. Over the following weeks, they worked through the bucket list. Alexander proved to be a terrible cook, burning garlic bread and somehow making pasta stick to the ceiling during their cooking class. They laughed until they cried, and the other students gave them amused looks. They spent an entire afternoon at the Met, wandering through galleries. Alexander was drawn to the modern art section, standing for long minutes in front of abstract paintings. "What do you see?" Chloe asked, studying a canvas that looked like random splatters of color to her. "Chaos," Alexander said, "but also purpose. Every mark has intention, even if we can't understand it. Maybe that's life. Maybe what feels random and senseless has some pattern we can't see yet." "That's almost philosophical," he smiled slightly. "Facing death makes you philosophical." "It's unavoidable." The jazz club was in Greenwich Village, a basement space with low ceilings and dim lighting. They sat at a small table near the stage, and Chloe watched Alexander's face as the quartet played. His eyes were closed, his fingers tapping the rhythm against his knee. He looked peaceful in a way she'd never seen before. When the set ended, he opened his eyes and looked at her. "Thank you for this, for all of it. You don't have to keep thanking me." "Yes, I do. You've given me something I didn't even know I was missing." "What's that?" "Connection. Someone who sees me as just me, not as Alexander James the billionaire or Alexander James the cancer patient, just as a person." Chloe's throat tightened. "That's who you are to me, just Alexander." His hand found hers on the table, fingers intertwining. It was the first time they'd held hands, and the touch sent electricity through her entire body. She knew she should pull away, should maintain boundaries, but she couldn't make herself let go. They left the club hand in hand, walking through the village streets without destination. It was late October now, the air crisp and clean, leaves crunching underfoot. Alexander had been in treatment for 3 months, and the disease was written on his body in weight loss and pallor, but his spirit seemed stronger than ever. "I need to tell you something," Alexander said, stopping under a street lamp. "Something I've been wanting to say for weeks." Chloe's heart hammered in her chest. "Okay. These past months with you have been the best of my life." "I know that sounds impossible given the circumstances, but it's true. You've made me feel things I didn't think I was capable of feeling. You've made me want to live, really live, even when I know my time is limited." He paused, searching her face. "I'm falling in love with you, Chloe. I probably shouldn't tell you that. I probably shouldn't feel it. But I do." Tears spilled down Chloe's cheeks. She'd known this was coming, had felt it building between them, but hearing the words out loud made it real in a way that was both wonderful and devastating. "I'm falling in love with you too," she whispered, "and it terrifies me. I know, I'm sorry. Don't be sorry." She stepped closer, close enough to feel his warmth. "Don't ever be sorry for this." Alexander cupped her face in his hands, thumbs wiping away her tears. Then he kissed her, gentle and sweet and full of everything they felt but couldn't say. Chloe kissed him back, pouring her heart into it, trying to convey how much he'd come to mean to her. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, Alexander rested his forehead against hers. "I don't know how to do this," he admitted. "I don't know how to love you knowing I'm going to leave you." "Then we don't think about that," Chloe said firmly. "We focus on now, on today, on whatever time we have. We make it count." They talked until nearly dawn, sitting on a bench in Washington Square Park, sharing fears and hopes and dreams. Alexander told her about the loneliness of his life before cancer, how success had isolated him in ways he'd never acknowledged. Chloe talked about her fear of loss, how her grandmother's death had shaped everything that came after. "I chose this job because I wanted to help people," she said, "but also because I thought if I could be there for others facing what my grandmother faced, maybe it would hurt less. Maybe I could make sense of it. Has it helped? Sometimes. But mostly I've just learned that loss doesn't make sense. It's not supposed to, we just have to survive it." "Will you survive losing me?" The question was barely a whisper. Chloe looked at him, at this man she'd come to love against all reason. "I don't know, but I know I won't regret this. No matter how much it hurts later, I won't regret loving you now." They officially became a couple, though Chloe had to navigate the awkward conversation with her supervisor about the situation. The hospital had policies about patient relationships, but given Alexander's prognosis, exceptions were made. Chloe appreciated the understanding, but hated the pity she saw in people's eyes. November brought colder weather and declining health. Alexander's energy flagged more quickly, and some days he could barely get out of bed. Chloe moved into his penthouse apartment in Manhattan, partly to help care for him, but mostly because neither of them wanted to waste a single moment apart. The apartment was stunning, all floor-to-ceiling windows and modern design, but surprisingly impersonal. Alexander had lived there for 6 years, but it had the feel of a hotel suite. "I was never here," he explained when Chloe commented on it. "I worked 18-hour days, slept, and worked more. This was just a place to keep my things." Together, they started making it a home. Chloe brought her vintage cameras, arranging them on shelves. They hung prints of her photographs on the walls. Alexander's vinyl collection moved from storage to the living room, and they spent evenings listening to jazz while watching the city lights. On good days, they ventured out. Alexander showed her his favorite places in the city, little spots he'd discovered during rare moments of downtime. A bookstore in Soho, a garden in Queens, a hole-in-the-wall restaurant in Chinatown where the dumplings were perfect on bad days. They stayed in. Chloe would read aloud while Alexander rested his head in her lap, her fingers running through his hair. They watched old movies, the ones Alexander loved. Casablanca, The Third Man, Singin' in the Rain. He'd seen them all dozens of times, but never with someone beside him. "This is what I missed," he said one evening, tangled together on the couch under a blanket. "This intimacy, this simple act of being with another person." Chloe kissed his forehead, which was too warm. The fevers were becoming more frequent. "I'm glad I get to be that person for you." December arrived with the first snow. Alexander's oncologist recommended stopping treatment, acknowledging that it was causing more harm than good at this point. They were in the territory of palliative care now, focused on comfort rather than cure. "How long?" Chloe asked Dr. Morrison privately, though she knew Alexander would want her to ask. "Weeks, possibly. Maybe a month or 2 if we're fortunate. I'm sorry, Chloe. I know this isn't just a patient for you." She told Alexander that night, holding nothing back. He'd always appreciated honesty, and she wouldn't start lying now. "Weeks," he repeated, testing the word. "That's not much time." "No, it's not. Then I need to do something. I've been working on it with my lawyers, but I need to finalize it now." He took her hand. "I'm leaving everything to you, Chloe." She jerked back, shocked. "What? No, Alexander, I don't want your money." "I know you don't. That's exactly why you should have it. I've watched you over these months. You care deeply about your work, about helping people. Imagine what you could do with real resources. The patients you could help, the programs you could fund. I can't accept this." You're the only person I trust with it. Please, let me do this one last meaningful thing with my life. Let my money actually help people instead of just sitting in accounts." They argued about it for hours, but eventually Chloe understood. This wasn't about her. It was about Alexander finding purpose in his death, knowing something good would come from all his years of work. She agreed, though it made her stomach turn to think about it. Christmas approached. Alexander was in pain now despite the medications, his body slowly shutting down. He spent most of his time in bed, though he insisted on making it to the couch for dinner each evening. "I want to give you something," he said on Christmas Eve. They decorated a small tree in the living room, and it cast soft colored light across the room. "I know I'm leaving you everything, but this is different, personal." He handed her a small, wrapped box. Inside was an antique camera, a Leica from the 1950s in pristine condition. "It was my mother's," Alexander explained. "She loved photography too, took pictures constantly when I was growing up. I want you to have it, to use it, to create beautiful things with it." Chloe couldn't speak through her tears. She held the camera carefully, reverently, understanding the weight of this gift. "I love you," she finally managed. "I love you so much. I love you too, more than I thought it was possible to love anyone." They held each other, listening to snow fall outside the windows, pretending for a moment that this wasn't temporary. The new year came without celebration. Alexander was sleeping more now, drifting in and out of consciousness. Chloe had arranged for hospice care, and nurses came regularly to help manage his comfort. But mostly it was just the two of them, existing in a bubble outside normal time. "Tell me a story," Alexander murmured one afternoon in mid-January. He was propped up in bed, looking impossibly fragile. "What kind of story?" "Our story. How we met, everything after. I want to hear it from your perspective." So Chloe talked, recounting those first meetings at the hospital, how she'd seen him absorb devastating news with such courage. She told him about falling in love despite knowing better, about how he'd made her believe in the power of living in the moment. She talked about sunrises and jazz clubs and terrible cooking lessons, about finding unexpected joy in the midst of grief. Alexander listened with his eyes closed, a slight smile on his lips. When she finished, he opened his eyes and looked at her. "Thank you for loving me," he said. "Thank you for making my life mean something. You always meant something. No, not like this. You made me feel, really feel for the first time. That's everything." 2 days later, in the early morning hours, Alexander died. Chloe was beside him, holding his hand, whispering that she loved him as he took his last breath. It was peaceful as much as death can be, and she was grateful he didn't suffer at the end. The aftermath was surreal. Funeral arrangements, lawyers, endless paperwork. The news of Alexander James's death made headlines, though few details about his final months were released. Chloe stayed largely out of the public eye, processing her grief in private. The will reading confirmed what Alexander had told her. Everything, billions of dollars in assets and holdings, transferred to her control. It was overwhelming and terrifying, but Chloe remembered her promise. She would make this mean something. 6 months after Alexander's death, Chloe stood in the lobby of the newly opened James Foundation for Patient Care. The building was bright and welcoming, designed to provide comprehensive support services for cancer patients and their families. Patient advocates, counselors, financial advisors, all working together to ensure no one faced their diagnosis alone. "He'd be proud of this," a voice said beside her. Chloe turned to find Alexander's former CFO, Marcus, who'd helped her navigate taking control of James Industries. She'd kept him on, along with most of Alexander's team, and together they'd restructured the company to focus on sustainable practices and employee welfare. "I hope so," Chloe said softly. She still lived in the penthouse, unable to leave the space where she and Alexander had built their brief life together. His vinyl collection remained in the living room, and she played his favorite records when the loneliness became too much. Her photographs covered the walls, including several she'd taken with his mother's Leica. Grief was a constant companion, but so was gratitude. Alexander had given her so much in such a short time. He taught her about vulnerability and courage, about the importance of truly living. He trusted her with his legacy, and she was determined to honor that trust. On the anniversary of his death, Chloe visited the cemetery where he was buried beside his parents. She brought fresh flowers and sat on the cold ground beside his headstone. "I miss you," she said aloud. "Every single day I miss you. But I'm doing what we talked about. The foundation is helping hundreds of people already. We're expanding to other cities next year. Your money is changing lives, making real differences." She paused, collecting her thoughts. "I'm not sure I'll ever love anyone the way I loved you. What we had was unique, born from impossible circumstances. You came into my life when you were dying, and somehow that limited time created unlimited love. I wouldn't trade it for anything." A year turned into 2, then 3. The James Foundation expanded across the country, providing support to thousands of cancer patients. Chloe remained deeply involved, though she'd hired excellent staff to handle day-to-day operations. She'd also started a photography nonprofit, teaching the art to underprivileged kids, using Alexander's mother's camera in workshops. James Industries thrived under new leadership focused on ethical practices and social responsibility. Alexander's legacy evolved from ruthless businessman to philanthropist, though Chloe knew the truth was more complicated than either label suggested. He'd been a complicated man who'd found love at the end of his life and let it transform him. On the 5th anniversary of their first meeting, Chloe received an unexpected package. Inside was a letter in Alexander's handwriting, along with a flash drive. "My dearest Chloe," the letter began. "If you're reading this, it means I'm gone, and enough time has passed that you might be ready to hear these words. I recorded videos during my final weeks, messages I wanted you to have but not immediately. I asked my lawyers to wait 5 years before sending them. I hope that was enough time for the grief to soften, for you to rebuild your life." Chloe's hands shook as she plugged the flash drive into her laptop. There were a dozen video files, each dated and labeled. She started with the first one. Alexander's face filled the screen, thin and obviously ill but smiling. "Hello, love. I don't know what day it is for you watching this, but I hope you're well. I hope you're living fully the way we talked about. I recorded these messages for different occasions. Your first award ceremony for the foundation work. Your 35th birthday, the day you might meet someone new. I wanted to be there for the moments I'll miss." Chloe watched all the videos over the next few hours, crying and laughing at Alexander's messages. He'd thought of everything, recording words of encouragement and love for milestones he'd never see. In the final video, recorded just days before his death, he looked exhausted but at peace. "I want you to be happy, Chloe. Truly happy. That means eventually opening your heart again if the right person comes along. Don't shut yourself off from love because of losing me. What we had was real and beautiful, but it doesn't mean you can't love again. In fact, I insist on it. Promise me you'll let yourself be happy." The videos became a source of comfort and strength. Chloe returned to them when she needed guidance or simply missed Alexander's voice. They reminded her that love didn't end with death, that the impact of truly knowing another person lasted forever. 7 years after Alexander's death, Chloe met someone. David was a photographer she'd hired to document the foundation's work, and they connected over their shared passion for visual storytelling. It developed slowly, friendship gradually deepening into something more. He knew about Alexander, about the great love Chloe had lost, and he never tried to compete with that memory. Instead, he carved out his own space in her heart. On the morning of her wedding, Chloe visited Alexander's grave one last time in her current chapter. She wore a simple white dress and carried a bouquet of wildflowers. "I'm getting married today," she told the headstone. "His name is David, and I think you'd like him. He makes me laugh, and he understands why your photos are all over our apartment. He's patient with my grief and celebrates my joy. I watched your video, the one about meeting someone new, and you were right. My heart was big enough for this. Thank you for giving me permission to be happy again." The wedding was small, just close friends and family held in the foundation's garden. As Chloe exchanged vows with David, she felt Alexander's presence like a blessing. The love she'd shared with him didn't diminish this new love. Instead, it had taught her how to love deeply, how to cherish each moment, how to find joy even in grief. 10 years after that day in the oncologist's office, Chloe stood in the now National James Foundation headquarters, preparing for the annual gala. The foundation had become one of the largest cancer support organizations in the country, helping tens of thousands of patients each year. Her photography nonprofit had expanded internationally. James Industries was consistently ranked as one of the most ethical companies in America, and Chloe herself had found a life she'd never imagined. She and David had twin daughters, Emma and Grace, who were now 3 years old. They filled the penthouse with laughter and chaos, bringing life to spaces that had once felt hollow with grief. Chloe still played Alexander's jazz records, and sometimes she'd tell the girls about the man who'd made all of this possible. At the gala, Chloe gave the keynote speech, talking about the foundation's work and future plans. But she also talked about Alexander, about a man who'd faced death with courage and found love in his final months. "Alexander James taught me that time isn't measured in length but in depth," she said to the crowded ballroom. "He had 6 months from diagnosis to death, but in that time, he lived more fully than many people do in decades. He loved completely, gave generously, and transformed not just my life but the lives of countless others through his legacy. Limited time doesn't mean limited love. Sometimes it means exactly the opposite." The audience applauded, but Chloe was thinking about a morning long ago, standing on top of the Empire State Building, watching the sun rise beside a dying man who'd somehow made her feel more alive than ever before. That moment had changed everything, setting in motion a future neither of them could have predicted. After the gala, Chloe returned home to find David reading bedtime stories to the twins. She stood in the doorway, watching her family, feeling Alexander's presence like a warm hand on her shoulder. This was his legacy too, this life she'd built, this happiness she'd found. He'd given her not just money and resources but permission to live fully, to love deeply, to transform pain into purpose. Later, after the girls were asleep, Chloe and David sat on the balcony, looking out at the city lights. The same view Alexander had seen every night, now filled with new meaning. "Tell me about him," David said softly. He asked occasionally, wanting to understand the man who'd shaped his wife so profoundly. So Chloe talked about Alexander, about his dry humor and unexpected vulnerability, about jazz clubs and cooking disasters, and sunrise on the observation deck. She talked about falling in love against all logic, about choosing joy in the face of grief, about learning that the heart's capacity for love was infinite. "He sounds like he was remarkable," David said when she finished. "He was. And he gave me the greatest gift. He taught me that love transcends time, that even brief connections can change everything, that being brave enough to feel deeply is always worth the pain of loss." She took David's hand. "He made me ready to love you." They sat in comfortable silence, and Chloe felt at peace. The grief would never fully disappear, but it had transformed into something gentler, a bittersweet gratitude for having known Alexander at all. His death had been devastating, but their love had been unlimited, expanding beyond those 6 months to shape everything that came after. In the apartment, surrounded by photographs and jazz records, raising children and building a future, Chloe carried Alexander with her. Not as a ghost or a burden, but as a part of who she'd become. He'd been right that day in the hospital when he'd wondered if random things had purpose we couldn't see. Their meeting, his diagnosis, the love they'd found in impossible circumstances, all of it had led to this moment, this life, this legacy. Limited time had indeed meant unlimited love, and that love continued to ripple outward, touching lives Alexander would never meet, creating change he'd never witness. But Chloe knew, deep in her soul, that he could somehow see it all, that he was proud of what they'd built together, that he was at peace knowing his death had created so much life. As she prepared for bed that night, Chloe looked at the photograph on her nightstand. Alexander on the observation deck at sunrise, his face turned toward the light, caught in a moment of pure joy. She'd taken it with his mother's Leica, and it remained her favorite image she'd ever captured. It showed the truth of who he was beneath the illness, beneath the billions, beneath everything. Just a man embracing the beauty of being alive. "Thank you," Chloe whispered to the photograph as she did every night, "for everything. I love you." And in the quiet of the penthouse, surrounded by the life they'd built together and the new life she'd created since, Chloe felt Alexander's love like a benediction. Death had taken his body but not his impact. He remained woven through everything she touched, everyone she helped, every moment of joy she allowed herself to feel. Their 6 months together had planted seeds that continued growing years later and would continue growing for years to come. That was the truth about unlimited love. It didn't end when someone died. It transformed, adapted, and continued creating beauty in the world. Alexander had given her that gift in his final months, and Chloe spent the rest of her life paying it forward, ensuring that his limited time created unlimited ripples of love, hope, and healing. The story of how she'd supported a billionaire through his terminal diagnosis had become the story of how she'd learned to truly live, how she discovered that love was the only thing that mattered in the end, and how even the briefest connections could illuminate an entire lifetime. That was Alexander's legacy, and it would continue long after everyone who'd known him was gone, living on in the foundation, the lives changed, and the love that refused to be limited by something as insignificant as death.